patience while we sorted out a couple of technical issues in the chamber here. So this is a work session of the Portland City Council. Today's date is May 10th, 2022. Today's subject is the Interstate Bridge replacement. Colleagues, as you'll remember, a number of years ago, the states of Oregon and Washington attempted to replace both the interstate crossing as well as a number of the interchanges along I-5. Unfortunately, that project never came to fruition for a variety of reasons. There has been a large group of people meeting on both sides of the river to discuss how to move this project forward. And about a year ago, I assigned Commissioner Hardesty the Bureau of Transportation, the Portland Bureau of Transportation. As such, she is the representative on the Joint Policy Advisory Committee on Transportation, which is a bi-state transportation commission that's been taking up this very important issue. Ultimately, what will happen is we will be asked as a council to sign off on what's called the locally preferred alternative. And there is expected by the federal government to be a consensus in our region around what that locally preferred alternative is to be. And so this work session gives us an opportunity to hear where we are from Commissioner Hardesty and PBOT and others in the community, as well as the Mayor of Vancouver, Mayor McCarney-Ogle. We appreciate your being here amongst others. And this will give us an opportunity to ask questions and level set before we get into the broader discussion of the locally preferred alternative, which we'll do later. So with that introduction, I will turn this over to Commissioner Hardesty. He'll kick us off today. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for that kind introduction. Thank you, colleagues, for devoting the time for today's work session on this project, which really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that will reshape a large section of our city and the Portland metro area. Today, we will be briefed on the proposed locally preferred alternative for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. The project proposal rethinks the current I-5 crossing over the Columbia, a critical connection between Oregon and Washington. This is a big milestone for the project. I think this is a good time to remind ourselves and everyone watching at home some of the context for how we got to this point and where we're going next. It's important for everyone to remember the Interstate Bridge Replacement is not a City of Portland project. It's not how we would spend this much money on transportation. It's not how we as a city would try to reduce racial disparities or carbon emissions. It is a project prioritized by two states and their governors with federal support to address an undeniable need for earthquake resiliency. Our job as a city has been to help the states make a project that does not undermine the City of Portland's goals. This is more than just a transportation project. This project will shape the growth of the northern half of our region for generations to come. We must make sure whatever is built reflects our community's values. Many of you remember a previous proposal for this quarter, the Columbia River Crossing Project. At that time, the city advocated for a smaller highway project that resulted in a proposal for 10 lanes over the Columbia River. Today, I am pleased to let you know we have before us a smaller, more efficient bridge proposal with 8 lanes that is more responsive to community needs. Today's recommended alternative is far from perfect and is not what we would have designed. Even with an 8-lane bridge, the project will likely produce a marginal increase in automobile capacity. But at this moment, after a lot of work at the regional table and after a lot of work from PBOT and community advocates over several years, today, we finally have before us a project recommendation that appears to be acceptable. Today's work session sets the groundwork for council action at our meeting scheduled for July 6th. I want to take a moment to share with you why I think the project recommendation should be approved by the City Council at that meeting. I also want to mention some issues we should plan to refine from today through July 6th with community input. Those issues should be addressed with conditions that we as a council adopt together on July 6th, in addition to our vote on the project recommendations. There are several reasons the project recommendation appears to be adequate in meeting our goals. First, the project will provide a dramatic increase in public transit service for a large portion of our region. It reduces the impact of the highway on Hayden Island, providing an opportunity to restore the street grid. It also provides a transformative investment in a network of corridors for biking and walking across North Portland, on Hayden Island, and in Vancouver. The project has a commitment to variable rate pricing, which is pricing to help manage demand in a way that we have not seen in the Pacific Northwest. It will have pricing that will help restrain the growth of emissions and driving. The project has committed to just one auxiliary lane in each direction over the river, with a commitment to establish a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target relative to the regional transportation impact. There's more work to be done. We wouldn't have come this far if it wasn't for the young climate activists and other community volunteers who have helped hold this project accountable. We need to continue to listen to those voices through the rest of this process. There are issues we refined by crafting conditions of approval that we will vote on the project recommendations July 6th. The major topics for this conditions of approval include public transit service. I understand the consideration of trade-offs that led to the recommendation for light rail ending at Evergreen Boulevard in Vancouver. We know that there's even more demand for public transit than what this plan can serve. How can we make sure this project will ensure that no transit rider is left behind? The impact of pricing on low-income communities. I understand and appreciate the IBR recommendation to study and recommend a low-income toll program that includes exemptions and discounts to the state transportation commissions. But I want to make it very clear that adding tolls to this river crossing cannot negatively impact underserved communities. Biking and walking connections to the bridge. I want to make sure that as we reconnect city streets in the bridge influence area, we are building complete streets with appropriate facilities for biking and walking. Urban design that respects our community. The bridge and other structures should be aesthetically pleasing and cost efficient. They should also help us create a sense of place, connecting people with the history of Vanport and Columbia River area. There are likely more issues that we will hear about from our advisory committees and from public comments in the weeks ahead. If we continue to work together to build the best project this can be, this effort has the potential to help us continue to grow our economy and our population with a lower rate of vehicle miles traveled and carbon emissions per person than most major metropolitan cities. That includes my prepared remarks, Mayor. I would now like to welcome three speakers I've invited to join us today. First, we're honored to have with us Roger Millard, the Secretary of Transportation for the state of Washington. I understand Roger started his career right here at Portland's Bureau of Transportation. Welcome back to Portland, Roger. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for the partnership. as we've moved forward on this project. I am Roger Millard, Secretary of Transportation, and my very first presentation to elected officials as a young person with far less gray hair was before Mayor Clark and the members of the City Council, including at that time Commissioner Margaret Strong, who I worked for when I was at PBOT. And it's great to be back. I lived in Portland for 15 years and was before this body talking about the Portland streetcar, which was a project I managed, and the Pearl District, which was another project, the planning for that that I managed as a part of the public-private partnership that was a big part of my early career. And I learned a lot from the city about partnerships and about how to develop a project. If there's anything I've learned over the last 40 years, is if you don't do stuff with people, they assume you're doing it to them. And so we've been working on doing this with our partners, and you'll hear from Mayor McInerney Ogle, and you'll hear from others about what, and my friend Lynn Peterson about what we've been doing as a team. Washington State DOT, at the direction of Governor Inslee, has been the lead agency in Washington State on delivering this program in partnership with our colleagues at the Oregon Department of Transportation. As has been mentioned before, we had a failure with the previous iteration of this, but the need remains. The do nothing alternative is going to cost the region $250 million just to keep the old bridge from falling down. And when the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake happens, when it happens, the bridge is likely not to survive. So there is a need for a compelling need for action from my perspective. But with the direction from Governor Inslee and the legislature being on board, we reached out, and our legislative colleagues reached out to their partners across the river, and we got going. And one thing that we agreed early on is before we started making difficult decisions, we needed to have a framework for making those decisions with the input of our partners. And we spent well over a year and a lot of kind of shuttle diplomacy meetings and like creating the executive steering group for this project, creating the equity advisory group, creating the community group that have been just instrumental in getting us where we are today. And I believe you'll be hearing from the project team later about just the volume of outreach that we did on this project. We're happy that we're at this point. I want to make sure that it's really clear to you that you will not be making a decision about an alternative to build in July. You'll be making a decision about an alternative to advance into the National Environmental Policy Act process in the form of an environmental impact statement or a supplemental environmental impact statement in this particular case. So the concept will be tested. And as Commissioner Hardesty mentioned, identifying conditions that you as a body want to be on the table as we go through that environmental process is important to us, because it gives us guidance on the social impacts you want to address, the environmental impacts you want to address, the economic impacts you want to address. Again, when I came to work for you back in 1983, I lived in Hazelville, and the bridge was crowded then. It encouraged me after about 6 weeks to actually move downtown Portland, and I walked to work from that day forward, and continue to do that in Olympia, where I live today. So I want to create that opportunity for the bridge to be there, for the region's trade, for the nation's trade, for the large metropolitan area that is the Portland, Vancouver metropolitan area that rivals, the Central Puget Sound and Vancouver as great big components of this Cascadia mega region. I have appreciated Commissioner Hardesty's hard work, the PBOT staff that's worked on this, our other partners at TriMet and the Port and Metro on your side of the river, and on our side of the river with the MPO, City of Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver, and CTRAN. I think, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And as Commissioner said, we don't have a perfect project, but I think we've got a pretty darn good proposal to advance into the next step of the process. So with that, thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to talking.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. We're doing good work together. Now I'm pleased to welcome one of our really regional leaders who has a lot of experience on transportation projects. Please welcome with me Metro Council President Lynn Peterson. She won't be on camera. She's out of town, but she made it a point to want to be here and provide some testimony this morning. So welcome, Metro Chair Peterson.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, and good morning, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. For the record, I am Lynn Peterson, Metro Council President, representing more than 1.7 million Oregonians from Gresham to Forest Grove and Hayden Island to the Boone Bridge and all of Portland. I want to thank you for inviting me today and for the opportunity to express my appreciation for Commissioner Hardesty and Mayor McInerney-Ogle's time and energy in participation on the I-5 Bridge Replacement Program Executive Steering Committee. It is so important for us and the people of the Portland Metro region to have a voice and be engaged in this process. It's the only way we can ensure that we are getting the best outcomes and the best bridge. As Secretary Millard mentioned, parts of the Interstate Bridge are more than 100 years old, and they aren't built on bedrock. They are built on top of timber pilings buried into the muddy bottom of the Columbia River, mud that is sure to liquefy during the next earthquake and take the bridge with it. The century-old Interstate Bridge is insufficient for pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, and freight traffic into and between the ports of Vancouver and Portland, which combine for 14% of the country's foreign cargo. This executive steering committee and all of the work on the project by the project teams and the staff on both sides of the river has been a big lift. But I believe we have also strengthened the relationship between the jurisdictions and have a better product because of it. And I'm going to give big kudos to Greg Johnson, the project manager, who you'll be hearing from today, for listening to understand and then acting on that understanding. Something that would have been helpful in the last iteration is the ability to listen for understanding from both sides of the river. So where we are today is a long way from where we were with the previous Columbia River Crossing project in both design and honestly where we are as a region. We have all grown a lot and not just in population. We think differently than we did a decade ago. We have new needs and values. Clark County, for example, the area is growing and the demographics are changing. And to meet the needs and values of their jurisdiction, they have developed an award-winning transit system with bus rapid transit. Award-winning. They're very proud of it. You'll hear that from the mayor. And as a transportation engineer, I can tell you how difficult big projects can be. But as a resident of this region, I also know how important replacing the I-5 bridge is for our economy, resilience, and quality of life. I am so glad we have been able to work as partners across the river with the City of Vancouver, Clark County, and Washington State, that we have been able to listen and learn from each other, respecting the differences that make each jurisdiction unique and the diverse needs of our constituents. Without the development of these relationships and learning about each other's needs and values, we might be in the same place we were a decade ago, and we might not have a bridge design that worked for both sides of the river. Thank you for all of your work in getting up to speed on this locally preferred alternative. And I encourage you to work collaboratively with all of the jurisdictions as we create the conditions of approval in each jurisdiction, as Commissioner Hardesty was mentioning. They will be important in being able to move the project forward. So I'm happy to answer any questions and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Chair Peterson, for making time to be here this morning. I'm very grateful. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a new friend of mine who I've gotten to know through this Interstate Bridge planning process. Please welcome Vancouver Mayor Ann McInerney-Ogle. It is so wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for making time to be part of this today.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanne. And yes, we have learned a lot together, haven't we, between chocolate cake and everything else. So I absolutely appreciate all the work that you and I've been doing together and time that we've spent together, all of the different opportunities, but also the progress that we've made with Roger and Lynn and everyone else. But Mayor, Commissioners, thank you for having me this morning. I know in the last couple of weeks, we've had the great opportunity to chat a little bit, and I absolutely appreciate the partnership that our two cities have built throughout this process. But as Joanne has mentioned, we've come a long ways in this IBR program, and we absolutely support the direction that we are headed. We believe the recommendations that have been brought forth last week reflect many of the values that we have in several different ways. So I'd like to share just a few thoughts with you on those transit pieces, tolling, and auxiliary lanes, or as we like to call them, kind of the ramp to ramp lanes. So with regards to transit, landing light rail here in downtown Vancouver, just south of the Evergreen Boulevard next to our award-winning library, thank you very much, supports Vancouver and our entire region. You know that we are one large region, as Roger pointed out. When you have fires, we breathe your smoke, we're sharing air, water, and the economy and all of the transportation, but we also all have plans for growth and that economic development. So landing that light rail over here integrates what we have, our existing, but also our future modes of transit and the investments that we have on our books. And for those who haven't been over to Vancouver, I invite you over. We'll have lunch down on the waterfront. We'll take a little walk and show you our existing C-Tran transit, but I'd like to brag a little bit because you know that C-Tran was the first to have our bus rapid transit system, as we like to call in the Vancouver-Portland metropolitan area. And so we are operating one line, we're in construction on a second, and by the time this bridge has a shovel in the dirt, we'll have our third line ready to rock and roll. So we're lining up all the funding for that. But as BRT continues to expand in Vancouver and in Clark County, that Evergreen area really serves as our transit district, an area, our transit district, that hub, where all of those lines come together. Not just the 3 BRTs, but our local buses, our express buses, and the new light rail piece. So for years, I'm sure you're aware that transit over from Vancouver to Portland, that cross-state transit service has been provided by C-Tran. We are the sole provider of that. And this system marries all of that together. As you will read through the whole IBR piece, those folks that are depending on those express buses get to continue to use it. All of those trips that start way up in North Clark County will come down. They can transfer in downtown. They'll have a new option for getting across the river. But the express buses will run on that new bus on shoulder lane across the bridge. And so it won't get stuck in traffic as it has now. That new transit district then combines light rail, the 3 BRTs, our express buses, our local buses, and it's where we are making it all work. So as Joanne pointed out, all of our riders, walkers, and bikers have an area, and we will get them through this region. So the recommendation for the new and important light rail is a tool in our toolbox, and it's not duplicating what C-Tran already has and is planning, but it is sending an important message that we can optimize all of this transit and work together for a full regional transit system without probably the hardest part of the old project, and that was those negative consequences of removing homes, displacement, and gentrification. So we're in support of that. We're also in support of the variable rate tolling that Joanne was talking about, because we know without tolling, we simply wouldn't be able to meet the funding needs of this program. Even with the state and federal piece, that's always been the third leg to this stool. And as major building projects throughout the entire nation, we know tolling has always been a part of that, and it will pay for that construction. It will also, we know, because of its variableness, that differential peak and non-peak hour rate will help reduce the congestion that we have. So as with all of the program partners, we're making our stance very clear. As Joanne pointed out, tolling cannot negatively impact those who are low income. I'm sure you're aware 70,000 commuters travel daily from Southwest Washington into Portland, and we need to ensure that there are equitable mitigations for those who are low income and who have come to live in Southwest Washington, where our housing market is slightly, ever so slightly more affordable. And so they've come to live with us. But that third piece is the auxiliary lane. And as we've all had those discussions, we like to call it a ramp to ramp lane. And we believe it works well in tandem with all of the other tools, including the new light rail. And with those recommendations, we believe that it will function well, and it's that right sizing, if you would, for our regional needs. But we have active transportation systems, and we know that they need to drastically be enhanced from what we have today, whether it's biking or rolling or walking and all of the new multimodal technologies. But I might have a little something to say about the scooters, and so we'll talk about that later. You might need to keep those on your side of the river. But we are very much into having our region climate friendly, support all of our economy and workforce, and the same goes for all of the freight pieces and freight access up out of our ports. So while I've talked about transit and tolling and that auxiliary lane, that ramp to ramp lane, those will be studied, and we know that, but we are so very much demanding that this study centers on climate and equity. I mentioned it last week when we were in our executive steering group, that we're putting on the record that the program has to ramp up their efforts to meet the state and local climate targets that we have. We're net zero in 2040, but also that it needs to have that additional analysis for that broad community engagement piece to reflect how this program supports equity. And so we specifically want to focus on avoiding displacements and enhancing access to transit and such. So we know that there's a lot of work to do, but this is an iconic, remarkable, functional project that reflects our past, your past, but also the dreams that we both cities have for the future. And as Joanne has conveyed, this project is truly a once in a lifetime opportunity for a large section of your city and a huge section for our city, but for our entire region. So thank you so much, Mayor Wheeler and commissioners.
Thank you, Mayor Ann. It's always a pleasure to be in a space with you. We have done some fabulous work together over the last year and 4 months, and I appreciate us continuing to move that work forward. I understand, Roger and Mayor Ann, if you need to leave, but you're welcome to stay if you want to hang out. But I do understand you made special time to be here today, so thank you both so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to PBOT staff who have been working very hard on the city's engagement in its planning effort. I'm going to turn it over to Art Pierce and Caitlin Reff. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to publicly appreciate the incredible work that Portland Bureau of Transportation staff have done in making sure that as this project moved forward, that it was consistent with the values that the City of Portland's Bureau of Transportation wants to move forward. And I can't think of two better representatives of Portland's Bureau of Transportation than Art and Caitlin. They have done a remarkable job. Thank you both so much for getting us to this point. Now you may take it away.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Hardesty. Thank you, Mayor Wheeler, and all of the regional partners and members of council for your time today. I am Caitlin Reff, Major Projects and Partnerships Manager at PBOT, and I'm happy to be here today to share with council the work that the city has been engaging on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program over the past year and a half, and gather your feedback and direction as the team proceeds. So we are here to discuss the proposal from the Interstate Bridge program team on the locally preferred alternative. But first, we're going to start with a quick overview from myself and Art Pierce on how the city has been engaging, why this project is so important and potentially impactful to our city and region, and how our City of Portland priorities have been received and reflected in the proposal you'll hear today. I just want to note that there is a lot of information. The team has also provided briefing books in advance that contain additional detail and technical analysis. So we want to ensure that we cover all the important components today. We're also going to try to move through the presentations fairly efficiently in order to have ample time for council discussion and questions to the team. Last, just quickly to point out, I know transportation uses a lot of acronyms. We're going to try to avoid those today, but IBR is kind of the shorthand, or IBRP, for the project name. So you'll see that on some of the slides. Okay, so as a quick reminder of the city's role, I think it's been mentioned, but this current effort began about 2 years ago based on direction from the governors of both states. The Oregon and Washington Departments of Transportation then established a joint program office, and we've been working closely with that joint office and 8 other bi-state partner agencies up to this point. Commissioner Hardesty has been participating on the executive steering group, who just last week, that group agreed that the locally preferred alternative should be carried forward and shared with council and other bodies for their input. In 2019, there was a regional letter of support signed by Mayor Wheeler, and that letter acknowledged the partner consensus on the need to address earthquake resiliency and provided direction on the other areas that were really critically important to address based on the previous effort, the Columbia River crossing. So based on this direction from council, we've been working closely with Commissioner Hardesty and her staff, as well as other bureau staff, to continue pushing for a project proposal that is more aligned to climate equity and our transportation strategy. And really this ethic that you've been hearing about already of kind of right-sizing the project. I know you're all quite familiar with the project area. Just to quickly reorient you around the primary study area highlighted here in red. In just a little while, we'll introduce the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program team led by Greg Johnson, Program Administrator, and they will walk through each of the major program elements and highlight how they have been responsive to changes in policy and physical context over the past decade. So now, why does this project really matter? I'm going to hand it over to Art to share a few slides.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. Art Pierce, Director of Policy Planning and Projects here at PBOT. We felt like it was important for us to stress sort of the scale and importance of this discussion and of the decisions we're making in this project. It's, I think, relatively obvious, but this is likely the largest single investment that I'll see in my career as a transportation professional in this region. And those choices we make can have a large impact, positively or negatively, depending on those choices we make. And this is an opportunity for us to deliver on our values around mobility and racial justice and climate change. And so we've been working hard to do so. And again, a reminder, transportation sector represents about 41% of emissions in Multnomah County. So is a major driver of our climate and climate action plan goal strategies is making sure that the transportation sector adapts as rapidly as possible. Also important to note how much equity is a factor within our mobility choices in transportation, particularly when understanding how transit and transit service and access to an automobile factors into the life choices of Portlanders. 27% of Black Portlanders don't have access to a car, and a greater proportion of Black Portlanders are transit users and have a longer commute, if not for us prioritizing transit service and the speed of transit. Also really important is how transportation relates to really the access to opportunity of our daily lives. And as system-wide reliance on car use spreads, it impacts the daily choices, the health and livelihoods of really everyone throughout the region. And so diminishing our reliance on the automobile, emphasizing these other options is critical to Portland's success as a region. And so what does more car use and increased traffic do to a city? Just a reminder, one key factor is around Vision Zero. We are a Vision Zero city driving towards zero fatalities and serious injuries, and there's a direct correlation between increased driving and increased fatalities on our roadways, particularly for vulnerable users such as pedestrians. It also increases the cost of our development. The more automobiles that we need to accommodate within the buildings themselves, the less buildings we can build to house people and other amenities within those structures. It also increases the cost of moving goods. If this freight vehicle, for instance, is caught in the correlated damage of lots of traffic where really that vehicle needs the priority to move through and continue on its route. It also requires more land and more land space. Examples of Portland's history in which we devoted a vast amount of land to the accommodation of auto trips. And again, a reminder about what is Portland doing to reduce our impact. Portland's strategy is focused on cycling, walking, and transit reliability. And so creating an all ages and abilities cycling network, that safe and accessible pedestrian environment, and fast and reliable transit all around supporting the vibrance of our centers and corridors land use growth strategy and those important places that people live and work. This is also particularly important for this discussion today, is looking at the future growth for Hayden Island and how this project can strengthen its connection to Portland and Vancouver without too much land use being taken up to accommodate ramps and ramp connections on and off. And you'll hear more about how the project is proposing to balance the council adopted neighborhood plan with the needs of the interstate commerce. And so the quick update on the trends, we are making continued progress. We are reducing drive-alone trips over the last 20 years and increasing cycling, walking, and transit trips, but we still have a long ways to go. And so this project can help us attend to those goals. We are still, while we are seeing changes in mobility behavior within Portland and within parts of Clark County, there still is the preponderance of travel is around the region is growing and driving demand. And so we need to make sure that we are doing the best we can to provide those alternatives and use those pricing mechanisms to shift travel behavior into the future. Yeah. Oh, and so I think I pass this back to Caitlin now.
Yep. Thank you so much, Art. So based on that, how can we really optimize this investment and influence the project outcomes so that people are actually better off when the project is complete? How can we address racial equity in supporting our climate targets? I think given the trends and future growth of the region, we have really been focusing on strategies that most support a transportation system that will help people reach what they need to, as Art was mentioning, to live safe, happy, healthy, and fulfilled lives. To make this work, and also strategies that really look to avoid or at least reduce the impact of increased car moving capacity. So to make this work, we've been focused on the need for an equitable pricing plan as part of the finance plan, increase in transit ridership by making it attractive, affordable, competitive, reliable, prioritizing freight so our goods can move more efficiently, and right-sizing the bridge to improve highway operations and safety while really limiting the amount of added vehicular car traffic to Portland's network in Central City. And using Council's 2019 guidance as kind of our North Star, we have been helping the project, or we've helped bring the project much closer into alignment with these values, Portland's values. And to get specific, I'm going to quickly go through how this guidance has helped shape the proposal before you today in three important areas, being climate equity and transportation strategy. So for each of these, I'm just going to run through kind of where we started a year and a half, 2 years ago, how we've been pushing, and then where things stand today. So for climate, a project with a larger highway footprint would result in more greenhouse gas emissions from system users or people driving their cars, which would take us further from meeting our statewide greenhouse gas and vehicle mile traveled per capita reduction goals. The larger footprint would also contribute to increased heat island effect and require more resources to build. So we've been working with a team and partners to establish a set of desired outcomes for the program that includes a goal to reduce project greenhouse gases. We've also worked to limit the size of the interchanges and truly understand in daylight trade-offs for additional vehicle capacity beyond what would be provided with a modern bridge design replacement. You'll hear more on these strategies and the partial interchange proposal for Hayden Island shortly. With equity, we started with kind of the base commitment to simply address the very inadequate public transit options today and identify acceptable high capacity transit solution. We also know this project will include a toll to help pay for the cost of the project, which, as previously mentioned, if not planned for correctly, would reduce driving access for low-income travelers. We know that with any additional capacity, there could be increased volumes of traffic on North and Northeast Portland streets and in equity priority areas. So the IBR team has convened an equity advisory group, which we've been participating in and helped adopt an equity framework for project decision-making. You're going to hear more about the recommended LPA solution that reflects a transit option with high equity benefits and a commitment to study and recommend a low-income pricing program. In terms of the integrating the city's transportation strategy, we've been highly focused on that balanced system approach that Art mentioned, how to provide high quality alternatives to driving for trips that are able to shift, and how to support our centers and corridors land use growth strategy. We've worked to more properly balance the operational needs of the highway with project right sizing, and you'll see in the LPA recommendation today that includes a light rail transit supported by bus rapid transit and only one additional lane over the river. So there is still a lot of work to be done. I think both in terms of what the team today is working on related to optimizing the transit solution and identifying additional studies or conducting the additional study of traffic changes on Portland streets, as well as getting additional input and feedback from our boards, councils, advisory committees in the coming weeks and months. But I think we are ready to proceed. I'm going to hand it. Oh, actually, really quickly before I wrap up and introduce the IBR team, we did want to share just a quick image looking back at where we were and where we're headed. This is the 2011 Columbia River Crossing Record of Decision. This proposal had at least 10 lanes over the river, more over the Columbia Slough, with 17 over Hayden Island. The size and scale of this project was just really massive. And over the past year, we've worked closely with the IBR team to make our city priorities clear. And many of these are reflected in the compromise recommendation that you're going to hear today. So with that, I am going to hand it over to the Interstate Bridge team. I'm happy to introduce Greg Johnson, Program Administrator, along with John Willis, Ray Mabey, and Millicent Williams.
Good morning, and thank you, Caitlin. Good morning, Mr. Mayor, Commissioner Hardesty, members of the Portland City Council. It is my pleasure to be here before you with this project. We are at a milestone point, but we are nowhere near the finish line, as has been observed. We have a number of key decisions to be made yet and key input yet before this project reaches its finality. So this is while it is a major step, it is not a final step. So we quickly want to walk you through why we are interested in replacing the Interstate Bridge. So let's go to the next slide, please. So there were 6 problems that were identified early on. These 6 problems still exist today. They have only gotten worse. We know that safety issues, impaired freight movements, as well as congestion are key issues for this corridor. We also know that the primary driver for this program is the earthquake vulnerability of this bridge. So we are very much focused on that and the damage that it would do to this region if this bridge were impaired. We also know that it is important that we have adequate bike and pedestrian paths. Right now, if you've ever walked or ridden across this bridge, you know that these there are narrow shared use paths with low railing, and the travel is tenuous. So we are looking to once again resolve that issue with a new modern active transportation facility. But one of the key portions of this project that we think makes this a truly multimodal corridor is the inclusion of high capacity transit across this bridge. We know right now the only transit across the bridge is provided by C-Tran, an express bus that goes from Clark County to downtown Portland. What we are looking to do is make this a true multimodal corridor. Next slide, please. So once again, you've heard about the governor signing the bi-state memorandum in 2019. I was brought on board in July of 2020. It's quickly coming on 2 years. I spent the first 15 months living in Portland. One of the first things I did was go and buy a bike. I didn't bring my bike from my home, but I bought a bike and rode around Portland to get an understanding of the community and the needs. I've also done a lot of walking. So the first 15 months I lived in just north and west of the Pearl District. And as I promised the partners, I've moved over to Vancouver for the last 7 months to experience how this project impacts the community of Vancouver and Clark County. So we have 90 million in funding dedicated by Oregon and Washington states as of March, as of this past March. We also know that Move Ahead Washington has allocated $1 billion. That's true construction costs or true construction funding needed to help complete the program. We have a bi-state legislative committee that provides us oversight and guidance. We met with them just last Friday, as a matter of fact. So this has been a very intense project with 10 partners that have been informing the program and telling us what is important for us to focus on. And we've heard the message clearly that climate and equity are the key frameworks that we need to make sure are addressed in a robust way in this program. We are unique for a mega project across the United States. We have a dedicated principal climate officer and a dedicated principal equity officer that work with us. We have a equity advisory group that is giving us input, and we have convened the climate officials from around the region to help inform us on this program. So this has truly been a collaboration for our team. Next slide, please. So we have, once again, a decision-making matrix, which we go through. We have, at the bottom, you see our equity advisory group as well as our community advisory group. We had over 500 applicants apply for approximately 30 spots to be a part of this program. So there is an intense desire in the community to have their voice heard on this. So those advisory groups report up to myself as a program administrator and the program administration team, and also help inform the executive steering group, which Commissioner Hardesty sits on, representing the city of Portland. So we also know that there are other decision makers in this program. We have federal funding partners such as Federal Transit Administration and Federal Highway Administration. We have permitting agencies such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the United States Coast Guard. So we also have transportation commissions. We have a number of different voices that have a desire for an outcome on this program. And at the top of this, you see the bi-state legislative committees. These are the committees that, or the members that, once again, give us oversight and input. We have been meeting with them on a regular basis. As of late, it's been twice a month. So they are updated on everything that we are doing, that there are no surprises. But we have made this a equity-centered and both a community-centered endeavor. We have spoken or had over 35,000 touches to the program as of last week in this year and a half. So that is, to us, that is a very impressive outreach that is necessary for a program of this type. Next slide, please. So we are right now still in the environmental phase. You'll see that the gray dot that we are identifying a draft modified locally preferred alternative. And once again, this is not the end. This is just telling us what we need to study in more depth to make sure there are no fatal flaws and to make sure that it meets the purpose and need of the program, as well as the expectations of the community and are centered in both equity and climate. So we are, as we move and as we seek approval from boards and councils to move into the supplemental environmental impact statement, that will begin hopefully later this summer and wrap up by the end of 2023. And then we will start more in-depth design and also start talking about community benefits agreements, how we put folks in the community to work on this program, get them trained and ready to be a part of this. And with the hope of beginning construction sometime in 2025. And although it's not shown on this graphic, we hope that to be wrapping up the totality of construction by 2032. So as you can see, we still have a long ways to go. And we will be seeking the input of Portland City Council as we move this project forward. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to my partner, John Willis, who is a program manager for our team. So John, it is yours.
Thank you, Administrator Johnson. I am John Willis, the program manager for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. Good morning, Commissioner Hardesty, Mayor Wheeler, and the rest of the council. It's great to have you all here, and as well as our partners who spoke earlier. Guiding the work we're doing here is a set of desired outcomes that was informed by the executive steering group. And I do appreciate the role of the executive steering group truly doing their job and informing what you're going to see later from our locally preferred alternative. I'm going to hit a lot of this content at a pretty high clip so we can ensure we have time to have the conversation that I think we need to have. So if anybody wants to slow me down, feel free to do so, but I'm going to go pretty quick here, very high level. So we have a set of desired outcomes that we have guided, and you can see they represent the contents of our purpose and need, those 6 that Administrator Johnson mentioned: travel demand, freight movement, public transportation. Next slide, please. There's a lot of detail underneath that you can see. Safety, bicycle and pedestrian, and seismic. In addition to those purpose and need, we have some additional desired outcomes. Let's go to the next slide. Focused on climate change and resiliency. I'm going to slow down a little bit on these. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially not just in design and construction, but most importantly in the operations of the facility. Minimize operational embedded carbon during construction. And structures that are resilient and are operable following anticipated climate disruptions, such as heat events, flooding, and sea level rise. And program limits other environmental impacts that exacerbate the effects of climate change. So keeping all of that in mind as we get into future phases, especially as we get into design. Let's go on to the next slide, please. We also talk about equity as a desired outcome. So really about increasing mobility, accessibility, and connectivity, especially for lower income travelers and people with disabilities and communities who experience transportation barriers. You heard a little bit of that context set earlier from city staff. We appreciate that. Fewer identity-based disparities in travel times, access, costs, and exposure for all the things related to transportation, including crashes. Local community improvements are implemented in addition to the required mitigation. We'll And Administrator Johnson talked about ways to engage the community as we move into future phases, as well as creating the economic opportunities that are generated by a program like this and the benefit that would benefit minority and women-owned firms, BIPOC workers and workers with disabilities, as well as young people. Equity priority communities in the area will have access and influence and decision-making power throughout the program in establishing objectives, design, implementation, evaluation of success. This is the process equity we're working really hard toward on the program to make sure that the voices, all voices have a say in how we move forward. And of course, as we go through, especially important in the next phase for NEPA, making sure that impacts are not disproportionate towards those communities. Let's move on to the next slide, please. We also have cost effectiveness and financial resources. You heard some discussion about right sizing earlier. One of the benefits of right sizing this program compared to the previous incarnation is that we do achieve some of the cost effectiveness. We are pursuing and leveraging all the funds we can to build this. So there will be local, state, federal matches, as well as the variable price tolling that was mentioned earlier. We're also identifying equitable tolling and pricing strategies, identifying those, making recommendations to our 2 state commissions that ultimately make the bigger decisions on tolling, but we have a say in moving that information upward with a recommendation. And finally, considering fiscal responsibility across all levels of the program and into the future, including new technology to solve future problems. Let's go to the next slide. So centering on climate and equity. You heard Administrator Johnson talk about that. Again, a lot of content in both our equity and climate frameworks that we have on the team. These were developed in partnership with our partners. The program is working hard to embed equity and climate considerations throughout the program in meaningful ways. Working with the advisory groups, Administrator Johnson talked about the equity advisory group, as well as the work of standing up the climate technical working group, which we affectionately refer to as CTWIG, which is a broader climate conversation that's been convened by the program. And we'll be using these equity and climate frameworks throughout design and construction. So setting them up now, using them to inform some of the decisions as we move forward, but really looking forward to engaging this group as we get into the really specific and important details in the future. Let's go to the next slide, please. So how are we centering equity? Again, a lot of great table setting done earlier in this meeting about the history of the region and how equity is key. For us on the program, really understanding the history of the river that goes all the way back through the millennia with people who lived here long before we were here, the I-5 corridor in the region, establishing a principal equity officer, the equity advisory group, very intentional and inclusive community engagement strategies. I'm going to speak a little bit when we talk about the components of this project on what we heard back, which also created great feedback and guidance for our team on how to move forward, as well as for the future, equitable procurement and contracting, and understanding the demographics to inform program design and strategies to further equity. Also, those demographics are helpful in us understanding equity, the process equity of who to engage, when to engage, and making sure that we are hearing those voices. We have a number of languages that we use across the program to engage with staff. So that accessibility and inclusion is key and important for us, as well as accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities. We have created models for people who are hard of vision and to be able to articulate some of the early decisions we've been making, as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, education, and training for the IBR program staff. As we're all on this journey together, these have been very helpful ways for us to center equity as we move forward. Let's go to the next slide, please. How we're centering climate, looking at the objectives and desired outcomes in climate. I'm just going to hit some of the high notes here as we look into our program specifically from the region and zoom in. We are looking at the operations of the facility, looking at the vehicles that will use it now and in the future, and how we shift to lower forms of travel, lower carbon forms. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And looking at the future and how we really can leverage what's coming in front of us to achieve even greater climate, positive climate impacts. For desired outcomes, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emission in support of state climate goals. We know we can't do this by ourselves. That's why we set up the larger climate working group. We are looking to be resilient as we move into the future and limiting environmental impacts elsewhere. Let's move on. So for the year in review, in fact, Administrator Johnson just pointed out that we are well above our 29,000 touch points for engagement. We have a very robust engagement. The volume has been turned up even more than what we saw in the prior planning efforts for the Columbia River crossing. 3 advisory groups, working groups that are very reflective of our community. And all of the values and framework and desired outcomes and the screening criteria we've used to get to where we are today have been informed not just by technical staff, not just by our partner agencies, but by involvement in the community. And the equity framework has been key in that as well, with how we engage. There's a whole year in review video that I encourage all of you to see to understand just how deeply we've engaged, as well as our website has an accountability dashboard that showcases what we've done. Let's move on, please. All right, under community engagement, I'll hit this also at a high level. I think what I really want to do is dwell on the community engagement related to how we move forward with the components of the locally preferred alternative. But you can see there again, surveys, community-based partner organizations where we've reached out and worked with them directly and compensated some of those organizations that have helped us do our work. A lot of listening sessions. We've actually set up community working groups, community briefings, and a lot of print, online, and radio advertisements. All of this has been done with 10 languages, and we've reached almost 7,000 monthly through the Interstate Bridge Replacement newsletter. I'll pause there and go to the next slide. The community feedback we've received, and you're going to hear some of this more, is in the future, is this desire to relieve congestion and reduce greenhouse gas. Really, people focusing on how they use the facility for trip time, as well as information on auxiliary lanes. In fact, there's been some feedback I'll share with you on auxiliary lanes as we move forward, those ramp-to-ramp connections that we've spoke about earlier. Let's go ahead and jump into next slide. High capacity transit. We heard a lot about high capacity transit, including general support. I'll talk a little bit about how that support is really across the region, but some differences on both sides of the river. And important values and priorities expressed for design option considerations. So I did mention that the community was vital in providing that feedback as we move forward. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the introduction of the recommended modified locally preferred alternative, as Caitlin mentioned, trying my hardest not to use acronyms, so that is a mouthful, but that is where we're headed. You heard Administrator Johnson describe why we are looking to develop this locally preferred alternative, and I will again at a very high level go over the components and ultimately share with you the holistic locally preferred alternative as we'd like to advance through all of our boards, councils, and commissions. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about 3 components, the transit investments, areas where we're going to take a little deeper dive to talk about the what, the Hayden Island and Marine Drive interchange. This was an interchange, a pair of interchanges that were really impacted by some changes since 2013, and auxiliary lanes. Auxiliary lanes are probably the most obvious way that we've looked to have the conversation about scale of the program. And I'll talk about some additional program, the program recommendation, the LPA, as well as considerations that we're going to take moving forward. All right, let's jump into transit, please. Next slide. So each of these sections, I'm going to describe the what. I'll try and use graphics instead of words to help understand where we are, because a lot of this is sort of how it lands, if you will. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the feedback we heard that took us to the place we are. So preferred transit, you may have heard this if you've been paying attention. The program looked at 11 transit investments. We landed on light rail transit, as been mentioned before, with an alignment that runs a little different than the last iteration. This is an alignment that runs along I-5 and terminates at an area that is the hub that Mayor Ann mentioned up in Vancouver. There are a lot of components to transit that we really won't be able to answer detailed questions on today, because they'll be studied further as we go into the NEPA process. So that part up above are really the key building blocks and components of transit. Let's go down and take a look at a picture on the next slide, please. What you can see here in the heavy dashed blue is of the 11 investment alternatives we looked at, this investment option was chosen, this light rail that starts at Expo and terminates up at Evergreen. And you can see all the other line work there showing bus and bus rapid transit routes in Vancouver that really coalesce at that hub there at the terminus at the north end. Next slide, please. A lot of key takeaways. I'm not going to go into all this given our time, but I do want to point out one thing that's really important. We model out to 2045. And one of the really exciting things for us as transportation nerds is that the ridership from other transit lines was the highest mode of transfer to the new light rail line that we're proposing and modeling across the river. That means that the models show that the work that's been done both on the north side over the last dozen years and the work that's been set up on the south side for the two transit agencies, this link provides a really meaningful connection that allows those two systems, north and south of the river, to really function as a complete system of systems. Let's go to some of the other takeaways. Some really important considerations that the team looked at, especially north of the river, is how that Evergreen terminus does function as a hub, including the transfer opportunities, as well as letting the connection there with the library district, both east and west across the freeway and still in the central business district, provide an additive sense of what we can do with transit. And the city of Vancouver has also seen substantial growth in the waterfront district as planned. And so how to accommodate transit use in the waterfront has been a really important consideration. Let's move on to the next slide, please. We heard a lot from the community, generally supportive of high capacity transit options, with many preferring light rail. Congestion relief was a top priority and reliability was important. From our equity advisory group, we heard that those equity priority communities expressed a high interest in accessible and dependable transit options, including multiple options that are efficient, reliable, and user-friendly. You're going to see that thread being efficient, reliable, and user-friendly, and support for infrastructure that promotes high-capacity transit and low-stress active transportation options. We don't develop transit in a vacuum. We do look at how people get to transit, and active transportation is a big part of that. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. We also had a broader community survey that showed support for implementation of high-capacity transit, greater connectivity from Clark County into Portland, travel time. A lot of people vote with their watches, I guess, or vote with their feet on travel time being really important. And so there were a lot of discussions about transit stations, where they're located, where people want to go. This is what we heard about. So waterfront, Clark College, Expo Center, Hayden Island, and the Vancouver Library, which we've been referring to as the Evergreen Terminus in this presentation. Interesting and really hot off the press, some community opinion polling results that were done just within the last month, showing that 79% of residents in the larger region, that includes both Clark County and the Portland metro area, 79% preferred light rail across the bridge. And you can see when you break it into some of the subcategories, we still have a majority of people supporting light rail, regardless of where they live. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I went fast through there. I'm going to pause, take a breath, and start talking about the Hayden Island and Marine Drive interchanges that we looked at. Key to this this pair of interchanges is that there have been a lot of changes since the 2013 locally preferred alternative. One includes the assumption of a North Portland Harbor Bridge replacement. This is the bridge that connects Oregon mainland and Hayden Island. Local access, auto access between North Portland Harbor and Hayden Island is also assumed, meaning we can take those local trips, move them off the I-5 freeway and onto a local access. Also providing bike and ped connections with a shared use path, again, across the slough between Portland and Hayden Island, and of course, across the river from Hayden Island up to Vancouver, and high capacity transit with a station on Hayden Island. I'll go into some of the details of where we landed with that. So we looked at a lot of different options here at Hayden Island and Marine Drive. And again, as was mentioned, I think, Caitlin, you mentioned we had 17 lane cross sections in the previous iteration. We were looking at operations, of course, being that this is a multimodal facility, operations for all modes, but we did look at footprint. And footprint was one of the big drivers that landed a partial interchange as the program recommendation. That partial interchange means that we have north-south access with direct ramps onto Hayden Island from the north, from Vancouver. To get to I-5 from the south, we have an arterial bridge, which you'll see on the right in that light gray color, a local bridge that means you don't have to get on the freeway to get over into Oregon. You then have some direct access roads that pass underneath without having to interface with the heavy freight on Marine Drive and can access I-5 to the south. Also worth noting is a yellow or gold line, depending on how you see it, alignment for light rail, just to show generally at a schematic level how we will route light rail through the area underneath the Marine Drive interchange over North Portland Harbor and onto Hayden Island with a station. Again, this interchange looks at something that has a little bit smaller footprint or a lot smaller footprint, but also focuses on operations. I'll move to the next slide, please. Key takeaways, smaller footprint. That smaller footprint means fewer impacts, also means a smaller scale and complexity over Hayden Island, which means a better experience and more space, more opportunity for creating connectivity on the island, as well as access east and west, which is hampered a bit by the freeway today. Hayden Island vehicle and freight access to North Portland from those local roads, as I mentioned, as well as looking at freight access to and from Vancouver via a new Jansen Drive and those direct I-5 ramps that go to and from the north. Let's go down to what we heard on Hayden Island Marine Drive. Community advisory group, people generally in that group were voting for smaller footprint, but wanted us to still consider freight needs and consider active transportation safety and access. Our equity advisory group wanted to make sure that equity was incorporated. They actually led to some screening criteria that incorporated equity as we look at all those options on Hayden Island. They wanted to make sure we looked at the human experience and impact, and there's more work to do there, as well as with this new interchange, pair of interchange configurations. Wayfinding was really critical, given that people will need to find their way on and off the island. Let's go to the next slide, please. For the community survey, congestion relief was important to the broader community. And people who were in Washington were more likely to prefer direct access to Hayden Island. Oregon residents were more likely to prefer access via Marine Drive and the local access roadway that I mentioned a couple slides ago. Our broader polling results showed that Oregon residents use Hayden Island just very few times a year and don't express much interest in what happens, whereas Washington residents, and when you really think about this, when you look at a map, very close to downtown Vancouver, so a lot of Washington residents are more likely to drive to Hayden Island and more likely to be interested in the highway interchange options. Let's go to the next component. As I mentioned, going through transit, then through Hayden Island Marine Drive, talk about auxiliary lanes briefly here, and then I'll talk about the entire component or the entire locally preferred alternative. So auxiliary lanes are those ramp-to-ramp connections that we mentioned earlier. These are used to get vehicles in with closely spaced interchanges up to speed so they can merge, diverge, and get on and off Interstate 5 safely. This isn't just for automobiles, it's also for freight. Let's go to the next slide. We have a video that we're not going to show today, given time, but we do have a video that describes aux lanes. You can find it on YouTube. We modeled, again, just like with transit through the year 2045, a no-build option, a one-lane auxiliary option. No build meaning we don't build anything, but everything else in the region that's part of the regional transportation plan gets built. The one auxiliary lane looked at adding an auxiliary lane from Marine Drive to Mill Plain. That's really critical in that those are two freight-focused interchanges for both the Port of Portland and Port of Vancouver ports, respectively. We also looked at a two auxiliary lane option as we were going through developing the locally preferred alternative. This is closer to what we saw in the 2013 locally preferred alternative. Next slide. Where we landed is, again, looking at operations, scale, and impact. Was the one auxiliary lane. We will take this into the study for NEPA to understand more about impacts and how it operates. Let's go ahead and move forward. Some of the benefits, there are travel time improvements for the aux lane compared to the no build. That's 3 minutes for southbound and 11 minutes northbound. Pretty significant improvements given that we don't have any auxiliary lanes across the river today. It does reduce overall congestion, creates less diversion to local streets. faster congestion recovery when there are crashes and other incidents, and a decrease in crash, improving safety. And we also have the Ox Lane does represent some broader improvements over the no build for the entire program, including mode shift, fewer lane changes required, greenhouse gas reductions. If that sounds, that may sound, when you have these extra lanes, they do reduce the greenhouse gas by getting the traffic to flow smoother, as well as some large safety improvements, just generally speaking, with the Ox lanes to allow people to use I-5 facility as it's meant, as a regional facility that carries a lot of freight. Let's go to the next slide, please. We heard a lot about auxiliary lanes from our groups that we work with, and a lot of different feedback. In fact, just like we've heard within the larger region, our groups gave us advice that was all over the board. People do care about the operations. And when we looked at the community advisory group, folks felt 2 lanes worked. Others felt that 1 lane, when combined with transit, was more appropriate. So we heard all over the board. Our equity advisory group wanted to understand difference in property impacts and displacements between 1 and 2 auxiliary lanes. Again, we have those screening criteria based on equity that will help us as we move forward to understand what those impacts look like, as well as travel time, and also for us, like with every other component of this project, to pay attention to projected demographic changes. And what does that mean for us from a design and operations perspective? Let's go to the next slide. Under the community survey, there's as always a desire to relieve congestion and reduce greenhouse gas, and a concern about potential impacts. Again, Ox lanes represent one of the easiest places for us to sort of articulate the scale of this program. The community opinion poll results, we found overall support for Ox lanes, with 1 Ox lane receiving slightly more support than 2 auxiliary lanes. And if you look down, you can see some of the details of how that changes depending on who we're asking or how we've asked the question when we talk about trade-offs. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is what we really want to get to, which is to talk about the Interstate Bridge recommendation, the modified LPA. Again, the LPA is that moment in time where we as a region get to collectively say what we want to move forward with. This is really important, not just for us to have, but also as we communicate up to our federal partners to have that unified vision of how we move forward to discuss. And you did hear, excuse me, you did hear Secretary Millard discuss that this is not the decision we're headed towards in July, are really these key building blocks of the program, but we have many more decisions and much more refinement to move forward as we go into the environmental process. So just as a recap, the recommendation looks at 1 auxiliary lane across the river, connecting both Marine Drive, Hayden, and Marine Drive and Mill Plain interchanges, variable rate tolling, transit light rail to Evergreen that runs adjacent to I-5, but still in the central business district of Vancouver. The partial interchange on Hayden Island creates more space and creates more opportunities to create east-west connections across the island, not just for vehicles, but for all modes, and addresses safety and operations by improving active transportation, adding shoulders, and increasing lane widths, and improving the ramp operations. We also, at the bottom of this placemat, if you will, describing some of the benefits that we can discuss today. We'll understand more benefits as we move forward. But today we can already tell you that with the preferred alternative, locally preferred alternative, we have 4 stations of light rail, an improved station in Evergreen, plus 3 new stations, 1 at Waterfront and 1 at Hayden Island, 1 at Waterfront in Vancouver, and 1 at the Evergreen where we have that hub. 3,000 residents will be within a half-mile walk. We're also going to see some dramatic improvements in jobs accessible via transit, 68% general, 73% for BIPOC, 59% for low income, and 79% or 71%, excuse me, people with disabilities. One of the first things we'll be able to share with you on greenhouse gas reductions are what we can measure today through our modeling, which are trips diverted to transit. We can calculate 36,000 metric tons per year, and we've got some comparisons of what that means, whether we're talking about houses or your vehicle, as well as some additional strategies to combat climate change, including demand management, the variable rate tolling we mentioned, increasing the operation and smoothness of operations on the regional facility, as well as doing ramp metering and adding those auxiliary lanes so the traffic flows smoothly. Mode shift from cars to active transportation, as was just mentioned, and something we can talk about more in the future. What are the low carbon emission construction strategies we can take moving forward. So I've talked about the high level. I'm going to spend just another few seconds here talking about, next slide, please, about the other considerations for our locally preferred alternative. We haven't really talked much about the bridge, and it's funny, the bridge is a big part of the program, but the bridge replacement on all of what we studied has been assumed with a seismically sound bridge. You heard President Peterson talk about wood piles and a bunch of pudding out there. So a bridge with 3 through lanes northbound and southbound, prioritizing a comprehensive transportation network. We've spoken to that. Safe and comfortable active transportation. We could spend a whole meeting talking about the connections we can make both north and south of the river with the paths that exist in our community that this locally preferred alternative can connect. Also, replacement of the North Portland Harbor Bridge with 3 through lanes each direction. The assumption of variable rate tolling, not only used for funding, which is necessary for funding to construct, but also to manage congestion and improve multimodal mobility within the corridor. We're also looking at improvements to additional changes within the program corridor, not as big and dramatic as the decisions we made at Hayden Island Marine Drive, but there are other interchanges we will look to for those efficiencies. Let's move to the next slide, please. So developing these commitments, identifying a modified LPA provides an important foundation, as I mentioned. It also represents a 2% design, so there's a lot more work to do, as well as we move through various boards, commissions, and councils with our 8 partner agencies. The program will be developing a list of draft additional work products that will need to be important considerations moving forward. That is, project cost and funding. Do we have time to go over this? Are we gonna, I think maybe I turn it back, maybe
John,
I cover.
I think people have an interest in cost and funding,
Yes.
but before we get into the conversation, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So if you could be efficient with this particular part, that would be great.
Absolutely. I'll hit it at a very high level. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, trying to be sensitive to time. Our preliminary range identified as part of a conceptual finance plan looked at 3.2 to 4.8 billion. Now that we have a locally preferred alternative, we can begin updating cost estimates again at a very high planning level to understand where we're landing. And as we mentioned in our desired outcomes, fiscal responsibility is really important. So really happy to go over this. The program's pursuing a variety of funding sources, including state, federal, and tolling sources. The Move Ahead Washington revenue package passed just a couple months ago, recently signed by the governor, allocates $1 billion in IBR construction funding. That was a very big deal north of the river, and we appreciated hearing that as a program. Also, we anticipate applying for federal grant funding beginning in 2023. And those grants, we have a lot of choices. So there's some strategy there, understanding what makes sense, where we're competitive, as well as for the Federal Transit Authority, the Capital Improvement Grant, which you'll hear us talk about CIG as we move forward in the future. That's really important. We have the Competitive Bridge Investment Program and the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. These look to be today the best fit for the Interstate Bridge project to apply for. Let's go to the next slide, please. We have mentioned variable rate tolling. The IBR program and the ODOT toll program that you have been hearing about are separate but related efforts, and understanding how those two interface. Our team's been spending a lot of time coordinating and will into the future as well, as these two are running parallel paths. Tolling objectives, as mentioned earlier, they're about revenue generation, but they also manage congestion and improve mobility. We will vary by the time of day and day of week based on a set schedule, so cost will be predictable for the traveler. So that's a variable rate, but predictable variable rates. The program is also committed to recommending equitable tolling systems, as we've heard our partners share, informed by best practices, and we will share that up with both the Washington and Oregon Transportation Commissions to determine we are in a position to recommend for that rather than decide. But I think we'll have a very good recommendation moving forward that is truly equitable. And we could begin tolling in late 2025 or early 2026 in conjunction with the program getting ready for construction. Let's move forward to the next slide, please. So for next steps, do we want to save that for after the discussion for Administrator Johnson? All right, I see.
Yes, why don't we do that, John?
Thank you very much. I'll take a sip of water, and looks like we'll pause for a break.
Thank you so much, Administrator Greg Johnson, and who else was, John Willis. Thank you both so much. We're gonna take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're gonna come back and dive into the conversation. Thank you all. Be right back.
Thank you.
We're in recess. Session, please begin recording.
Recording in progress.
So are we at the Q&A?
So yes,
section
Mayor, I
here,
think
Commissioner?
Millicent is going to lead us through a facilitated conversation. So she's to ensure that each of us have our voices heard. Millicent, welcome.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Hardesty. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Hardesty, and members of the Portland City Council. My name is Millicent Williams, and I am one of the IBR program facilitators charged with ensuring that we advance conversations that support the IBR Executive Steering Group's efforts to make decisions on this important work. I'm here today to facilitate what we anticipate will be a robust discussion on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. The team is standing by to answer your questions and to address your concerns. You've heard a lot, and to the extent that you've been able to review the briefing books that you received, you've seen a lot. This will not be the last time that we have a conversation, but it is the start of a meaningful series of discussions about our future. Before we launch into the conversation, I'd like to confirm how much time we have for the conversation. We were slated to have about 30 minutes, but I recognize that we are nearing the slated end of the session. So if someone could let me know that.
This session goes until 11:30, and then we'll have to adjourn.
Thank you very much, Mayor Wheeler. All right, and so without further ado, and I'm happy to entertain your questions, I'd ask that as you prepare to share your comments or concerns, you raise your virtual or actual hand, and you'll be acknowledged, and we will proceed with the conversation. So, who'd like to share their thoughts first? Mayor Wheeler.
Hello, good. Okay, I have a couple of comments as well as questions. And I guess the first question I would ask is about lessons learned. I think we can all acknowledge that the last time we attempted this project, it didn't go well. And there were a number of reasons it didn't go well, from credibility to leadership to assumptions that were made about congestion and pricing. I would like to believe that this group that has convened has learned from those lessons, but I have a couple of specific questions. First of all, with regard to the question of congestion, I saw some data in the report about congestion. Did we use a different methodology around congestion this time? And specifically, what assumptions are we making about the growth of transit throughout the area relative to the growth of population and automobiles in the area? In other words, over time, even if we see a reduction in the percentage of people driving automobiles, given that this is a 100+ year project, what assumptions are you making with regard to the growth of transit, the transfer of modes to transit relative to the growth of automobiles?
So thank you for the question, Mayor Wheeler. We use the Metro model as our projection, as well as the RTC model to project what the transit usage and the shift from automobile to high capacity transit would be. There are certainly refinements that can be done, but right now, this model and the projections has gotten us into the ballpark of where we think the mode shift will be. There are other things that we can do to help facilitate that mode shift via tolling, via the variable price tolling that is being looked at. But we are strictly adhering to the models and the models runs that have been done by Metro and RTC staff.
All right, and we're very limited on time, and these are complex issues, and my colleagues all have questions. So I'll just put on the record that I'm going to do a much further, deeper dive on the congestion assumptions. I do want to ask one other question about it, though. As you achieved your congestion reduction data that was in the slide deck that we just saw, I think it was an 11-minute reduction during peak time northbound, is that assumption based on eliminating bridge lifts? In other words, what percentage of that reduction in time is as a result of eliminating the bridge lifts from your overall time spent in congestion?
You want me to answer that?
Yes,
Administrator
John,
Young?
if you would go ahead.
We are assuming a fixed bridge, so our models don't have any bridge lift assumptions in them. I don't have an answer as far as what percentage that reduction is related to, but again, we're modeling out to 2045 without bridge lifts as a consideration.
Great, and I appreciate that because that's a conservative assumption, and that's what I'd like to see. I'll just put on the record that I was deeply concerned about the financial assumptions that went into the modeling. The last time around as the state treasurer, I was asked by the governor to evaluate the financial modeling, and it came up very short. And so I hope that there was a lot of learning that went into that exercise, that we won't run into some of the same problems this time. Aesthetics was not mentioned, and I know that the mayor of Vancouver, as well as myself, aesthetics matters to me. This is the gateway to the states of Oregon and Washington. I realize that we're under pressure around the height of the bridge over the mean water level from the Coast Guard. We also have height restrictions as a result of the Federal Aviation Administration and concerns about flight paths. But that doesn't mean we should have an ugly gateway into our city and into our state. And so at what point, I understand it's not part of the LPA, but I also don't want to end up getting squeezed by the federal funding timeline. When will we have the discussion around the aesthetics of this bridge, since we're going to have to live with this bridge for 100 to 150 years?
So, Mr. Mayor, the aesthetic piece is coming. We have a firm on board that has done work worldwide on bridge aesthetics and integration into the context of a community. We know we are limited in bridge type by those height restrictions you mentioned, but we will start producing renderings probably within the next 6 to 8 months that start looking at some of the options for aesthetic choices for this bridge.
Okay, well, here's a question I have about that, because what we ran into last time was repeated statements that the aesthetic discussion would come later, but then when later happened, we started running into the deadline for federal funding and the urgency to get this project on the list for federal funding. In other words, it got shortchanged. I noticed that in the timeline that you put up in the slide deck we just saw, pre-construction actually starts in 2024, which I assume means that the federal financing will be lined up prior to that, which means that the aesthetics has to be completed prior to that. So if we're waiting 6 to 8 months and pre-construction starts in 2024, how much time are you planning to leave for the conversation around aesthetics or any other aspect of this project?
We will be doing a number of workshops in this time frame. And when I say 6 to 8 months, that doesn't mean that that's the beginning of the aesthetic conversation. We believe that we have to understand, number one, what our locally preferred alternative is trending towards, and have that information as we start delving into the aesthetics piece. But we recognize that's an important consideration. So it will not get shortchanged. It will not be
and I heard you, and I'm not trying to be rude.
We're running out of time.
Right, I just want to keep going and make sure I get this on the record.
Understood.
The last time around, we had two governors who were very intentional and supportive of the project, Governor Gregoire in Washington, Governor Kitzhaber in Oregon, and they both left. And that left leadership of the project somewhat in the air. Who is leading this project? Is it you, Greg? Is it you, John? Who is in charge of actually executing on all of these different work groups and these different government entities that all have a say? Who is ultimately responsible for delivering this project on time, on budget, and the way we want it built?
So as the program administrator, it is my responsibility to put together the team that will deliver for the partners in this region. So the governors via the DOTs have put me in as a shared resource between the states of Washington and Oregon. So the buck stops here and we'll get it done.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's all my questions for today.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler.
Excuse me,
Commissioner
Mayor.
Matz?
Before we go to someone else, I just want to put on the record, we have the opportunity to put conditions of approval when we vote in July. And I share your concern about the urban design and a couple of the other things that you mentioned. So I just wanted you to know that just because it's been presented to us in one way doesn't mean that we don't actually control what we vote for.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that. And my intent today is obviously not to resolve these issues, but to just put on the record that I still have open questions.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. I see Commissioner Matt's hand is raised. Commissioner Matz.
Thank you, and I might take a variation on the mayor's strategy. First, I appreciate the presentation. I do have questions, and we can divide these questions into two buckets, environmental issues and economic issues. Given the amount of time that's left on the clock, what I'd like to do is, I think, just list the environmental questions I have, and maybe staff can follow up in an email or private conversation because I'd like I'd like to have Commissioner Ryan and Commissioner Rubio have a chance to get back in here. And for now, I'll just stick with the environmental questions. I'd like to learn more about how this project is likely to impact the habitat and endangered species, and what are the strategies for mitigating those impacts. That's the first question. The second question is I'd like to learn more about the impact this project is going to have on stormwater and stormwater treatment. If you could follow up on that, I would appreciate that. Third, I believe there is a water line that goes across the current bridge. I assume that water line will need to be replaced with the new bridge. I'd like to learn more about how that aspect of this project will work out and how you will coordinate with the Water Bureau to get that done. And the fourth question that I'd like some feedback on is whether or not and how you are coordinating with the Levee Ready project to ensure flood protection as we go about pursuing this project. And I realize that's a lot. I'm not going to ask you to even try to answer that now, but I look forward to learning more about those issues. Thank you.
We'll be happy to provide the answers to all of those in depth, Commissioner Matz.
Thank you, Commissioner Matz. I see that Commissioner Ryan's hand is raised. Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation, first of all. It's a pleasure to sit through it, and definitely allowed me to have much better understanding. I can tell all of you have been working very closely together. I will give just some context of my questions, know that we won't have time to answer them, but at this moment you have my concerns. I want to just start with my lived experience. It's pretty geographically pertinent to this project. In high school, I lived on Hayden Island. I rode my bike to Roosevelt High School on a good day, and that's in the late 70s. And then I lived on Vancouver one summer where I worked on Hayden Island, so I rode my bike over the Interstate bridge. My point is, I'm really grateful to hear and very deeply appreciative of the focus on pedestrian and bike modalities, because I'm well aware of how bad it was back then, but I was young, so I just went for it, did it. Now I'm a resident of North Portland off Rosa Parks, so that shapes my questions as well today. And I think for me, then the concerns are with Hayden Island's access and safety. And we just want to make sure that the good neighbors in Hayden Island actually feel like this will be an asset to them as a neighborhood. And they are a gateway to our great state. And so the traffic, and then the other is the traffic congestion in North Portland with what I saw. So those would be the two areas, concerns with basically the geographic locations that I'm very closely aligned with. It appears that it's all about these auxiliary lanes, which I'm just barely understanding, and I understand that you all have that knowledge, and we'll have deeper conversations. And I just want to understand what the concerns are, or why the decision was made of choosing the one over the two auxiliary lanes. We don't have to answer that today, but just based on everything I was listening to, based on the polling, if you will, that you did with some of those that that called in. It looked like that was a robust conversation. So far be it from me to not want to understand more about the details of that debate between 1 or 2 auxiliary lanes and how that relates to both the good people at Hayden Island and those in the North Portland neighborhoods that feed into this system. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan. We've noted all of your concerns and questions. The team does stand ready to answer those as we're able to schedule to meet with you and to provide those responses in writing. I see that Commissioner Rubio's hand is raised. Commissioner Rubio?
Thank you, Millicent, and thank you, Greg and John, for the presentation. And I will join my colleagues, and I have 3 questions. I don't expect an answer today, but I want to get them on the record, and we'll look forward to receiving answers to those questions. As you know, we, as a council 2 years ago, we declared a climate emergency, and also equity is also a value that we espouse quite a bit in our policy making as well. So my questions are reflecting those lines. The first is around how the project is centering climate, and you talked quite a bit about that. I'm really interested in how this version of the project helps reduce the long-term carbon emissions relative to the original designs. It'll just help me understand how far the project has moved. And then also what are plans about furthering reducing carbon footprint during the construction phase. And I know that's a little bit ways out there, but it helps to already get thinking about that. The second question that I have is around the project footprint. We adopted the Hayden Island Neighborhood Plan in 2009. And so what my question is about is how does this project allow for that visioning that's called for in that plan to continue? And then also, if you can describe what kind of community outreach that is happening to involve neighborhoods and project stakeholders in the area, that would be helpful for me to understand. And then my final one is, as Commissioner Parks, thinking about the parks nearby, what are the impacts and opportunities for parks facilities? Delta Parks is near, and I just know there are several recreational and active transportation routes there. So how does that impact that, and will the project improve public access to the river as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Your questions, comments, concerns have been noted. The team will respond both in writing and with the invitation to have a conversation in person if that is something that you'd like to do. And if that conforms with Commissioner Hardesty's expectations regarding connecting directly with her colleagues. I see your hand raised, Commissioner Mapps, but Commissioner Hardesty has raised hers as well. I'm not sure, Commissioner Hardesty, if you wanted to wrap the conversation or if you have a question or something that you'd like to amplify that would help to make the conversation richer at this point. So,
well, thank you so much, Millicent. If Commissioner Mapps has another question he wants to put on the record, I'm happy to defer to him in this moment.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Mapp.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. I'll keep this short. Previously, I asked a couple of questions about the environmental impact of this bridge. I also have some questions about the economic impact of this bridge. Specifically, there's some businesses, especially manufacturing, that need to move product underneath the bridge. I'm told the proposed bridge is too low for those products to move back and forth. I would very much appreciate it if we can get a written response on how that problem will be fixed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a moment to thank my colleagues for their very thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have enough to get into a really full-fledged conversation, but there's a lot of time between now and July 6th to get many of the questions answered that were raised today. I also just want to put on the record a couple of questions. I mean, for me, I'm still very worried about how we're going to make sure that we're sharing the revenue that this towing will create, because as we know, there will be diversion traffic in neighborhoods, and we need to make sure that we're intentional about how we share those resources. That's a really important piece for me. I also want to make sure that as we push low-income people and people of color out to the edges of our cities, that they are not actually, we're not exacerbating their transportation issues by tolling verbal or otherwise. And then the third thing I will say is equity means that Black and brown people will have employment opportunities, housing opportunities, multimodal transit opportunities. Equity goes through every phase of this project. And finally, I want to end by really thanking Greg Johnson. He knows I was a hard sell. In fact, I'm happy he still smiles when he talks to me, because this has not been an easy process, because of course, when you're talking about building something for the next generation, you want to make sure that the people that you're in partnership with really are have that same commitment. And I really want to appreciate Greg Johnson, John Willis, and especially our former PBOT Shiro, Millicent Williams, who is now actually facilitating this process for the IBR project. This has been a hard project to get to this point. And I think when you're talking about a regional partnership, nobody's jumping up and down saying, this is the best thing I've ever seen, which means we must be on the right track. Because people have made compromises and people have accepted that this is not a project that will change the entire region. It will be have a huge impact on the region, but it can't fix all the region's problems. I would encourage you to please, of all the questions that you've heard today, if you could put it in writing, the responses, and send it to all of us. And then if there are additional questions, I will make sure to get it back to you, Millicent, so that we can do a thorough job as we prepare for July 6th. And thank you all again. And as you see, this is the next steps of where all the committees that will be weighing in on the IBR project will be convening. I will say when it comes to the locally preferred option, the City Council will be the first at the vote. And our vote will be July 6th. And please make sure if there are any additional questions that you reach out, and we'll get those answered as quickly as possible. And thank you, Mayor. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Thanks to everybody at PBOT. Thanks for all of our guest presenters today from the project. This was a very informative and action-packed hearing in a very short period of time. To be continued. Colleagues, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Recording stopped.